Thank you so much. I'm Andrew
Thank you,
Hamilton.
Andrew.
I'm Andrew Hamilton. I'm Associate Curator of Arts of the Americas at the Art Institute of Chicago and a lecturer in the Department of Art History at the University of Chicago. Thank you, Paulo, so much for inviting me to be a part of this and to present today. And thank you, everyone, for all of your really thought-provoking presentations on Tuesday, and Juan for this wonderful presentation this morning. It's really exciting for us, I think, to all come together and think about architecture and scale and maquettes collectively. And so I thought what I would do today in sort of a more open way is just use this space to share some of my past and current work. And then in order to ask some new questions for which obviously I don't actually have answers to yet, but I'm hoping that it's something that we can think about collectively with all of your expertises and sort of pursue these questions over the duration of this multi-year seminar. So my first book was entitled Scale in the Incas, and it considered broadly the role of scale in Inca art, in Inca built environments, and Inca worldviews. It was published by Princeton University Press in 2018. And my hope is that soon there'll be a Spanish edition in Lima. I'm very excited to make this scholarship more accessible to the academic community in Peru. One of the let me see if I can advance slides. Yeah. In some ways, it was a sort of survey of the kinds of objects that we've all been very familiar with in the field of pre-Columbian archaeology and art history that we might have called miniatures. And miniatures are a sort of category of object that we have long been aware of through a lot of different ancient Andean cultures. The book specifically looked at this, however, with the Incas, who were in sort of the long range of cultural tradition in the Andes, the last. And in some ways, I think what they did with miniatures or reduced scale objects was potentially the most expansive and diverse attention to scale of many of their predecessors. So in doing this sort of survey of reduced scale objects, the book touches on a lot of different very familiar categories of reduced scale objects from the Incas. What I'm showing you here are illustrations that I did of canopas. Canopas are a very, very common Inca artifact. They commonly take the form of a reduced scale llama. And what we know from 16th century texts were that Incas would actually attend to these small sculptures of llamas as if they were the sort of vivifying or life-giving object for their actual herds of llamas. So you would take care of your canopa and make offerings to it, and even in some instances give them wives or partners so that they'd be happy and have a family. And as long as the canopa was happy, it was believed then that the canopa would look after your actual llama herds. So there's this whole idea of potentially kamai, which was an Inca concept, sort of like mana, that you had the sort of animator of llamas as a constellation in the sky, and that this was the model on which all actual llamas, actual animals, that all of life was sort of a reduced scale version of what was happening in the constellations. And then the canopas themselves were another reduced scale version of actual llamas. So sort of in the way that Juan was just talking to us about sort of fractal relationships, you had these multiple levels of reduced scaled relationships that all had implications and sort of power and sway over the level either above or below them. Another another sort of class of objects that I was often looking at was reduced scale textiles and reduced scale objects where, you know, unlike the canopa, which of course was made out of stone, these were made objects where the methods of constructions and the way in which they were woven was identical to the way that the full-size object would have been made. And so this is something that, you know, going back to some of the questions that we've raised in previous presentations, like we've often looked at as, you know, doll clothes or some kind of sort of accessory to the main reduced scaled object, which would have been a gold figure or a spondylus figure or a silver figure. But what I in the book tried to sort of draw out is the degree to which it wasn't a representation of the full-size tunic at a smaller scale. It was actually the exact same creation, entirely made at a smaller scale. But obviously, as we can see in this image, with a number of differences in the sort of larger tunic, we have way more squares in the checkerboard pattern than we do in any of the smaller versions. So this raises this really sort of interesting challenge for us that I'd like for us to think about, especially in terms of architecture, is whenever you change the scale of something, you either get the chance to increase or decrease the level of detail or the level of information that the object encapsulates. And it raises the question of sort of what is the threshold of information that needs to be in the altered scale object for it to still be conceptually or artistically or utilitarian in a utilitarian way, still bear relationship to the original thing that it was replicating in some way. And so finally, one of the sort of conclusions of the book is looking at the Inca practice of child sacrifice. And it was a ceremony called the Capacocha. And in the book, I argue that Incas were actually using children as reduced scale versions of humanity, of the Inca people, and making sacrifices of children in the same way that they would make offerings of reduced scale objects. So throughout the book, what I'm sort of presenting is that there were very critical sacred and symbolic dimensions to the objects, but they were used as tools within Inca culture. And in this enormous empire that the Incas created, they were bringing so many different indigenous groups into the fold that were multi-ethnic, multilingual. This would have been a very powerful and effective way of communicating ideas in a non-lingual, non-textual way. You know, creating a reduced scaled object that communicates the idea of something else is in some ways sort of what a word does. The word that we speak communicates the idea of something not present, something that we're conjuring the idea of. So throughout the, throughout Inca material culture, built environments, and worldviews, what I argue is that there is this constant reliance on scale and the creation of scaled relationships between the reduced scale object or the enlarged scale object to a referent, where that scalar relationship is almost being used as like a grammar, as a way of articulating knowledge to convey that to other people. With this, you know, we have a whole subset of these works that actually are either creating reduced scaled versions of built environments or reduced scaled versions of architecture. This is a section of a very, very large rock that, that Patricia actually showed us in her presentation on Tuesday. It's a landscape, reduced scaled landscape of terraces at a Inca waka called Titicaca in Cusco. And you can see that it's very, very similar in style to the landscapes that Patricia showed us at Sandondo. enough to raise the question for me as to whether this was actually an Inca creation or potentially an earlier creation. And you can see the way in which the landscape, which is about this big in total, it sits at the very top of a very large rock outcrop that overlooks the Cusco Valley. And in the back of the landscape, there's a sort of natural crevice in the limestone. And it's very clear that one could pour a libation into this reduced scaled model of terraces, and that the liquid, whatever was poured, would course over the terraces, symbolically irrigating these terraces. That the liquid would then accumulate in this sort of cistern or depression, similar to something that in an Inca term we might call a pakcha. But what's extraordinary is that this entire, the libation would eventually run down the entire surface of this entire rock outcrop. There's a little place here where it causes the libation to bifurcate and then rejoin, which is a important idea in Inca thought of sort of the division and reunion of liquid. I think we'll see it in some fountains and such later. Then the libation would actually fall through an opening in the roof of a cave. And inside the rock, there was this entire cave that one can stand inside. It's very large. And the libation would actually come through the ceiling of the cave. And there's an altar, and one could have some kind of ceremony underneath. So it's a reduced scale landscape that we can really imagine being used in some sort of Inca ritual that would celebrate or look to the irrigation of fields and these agricultural terraces within the Cusco Valley. And part of what I argue in the book in the middle chapter is that this is part of a suite of very, very similar objects that the Incas used. Another is, the Cywitte Stone. And what I'm going to show you here is a video, hopefully it will play, of walking around the Cywitte Stone. This is an enormous carved rock outcrop that the Incas created at the site that Jean just showed us. And what you can see is that, very similar to the landscape that we just saw at Titicaca, is that on the top surface of the boulder, we have a whole array of figures and animals. There's pumas. Here's another irrigation channel, a frog in a puddle, open fields, pumas, representations of architecture. It's a really, really extraordinary object that's been called a maquette. It's been called a model. It's been called a map. But I really think of it as this reduced scale landscape, similar to Titicaca. And what I want to draw your attention to is, scattered throughout this entire landscape, which is very representational, sort of representing the Andean landscape and sort of the mountainous region in which we actually do find this boulder. We have the same kinds of pakchas and chutes and cisterns for rainwater to accumulate within the vessel, within the pakchas, and then the water or the liquid would flow from one pakcha to the next down the surface of the object, and then penetrate these holes around the waist of the rock. And then the liquid will fall to the underside of the rock and irrigate the land underneath. So we have the exact same sort of utilization of this reduced scale model that we saw at Titicaca. You can pour some kind of libation over it. The liquid will flow over it. It will penetrate down through the rock and come out on the other side. And then we have that again and then throughout these this reduced scale landscape, we have, of course, depictions of architecture. So here you see a small Inca structure with two doors and a sort of terrace in front of it and terraces below. We have that again, for instance, at Machu Picchu. Here's another reduced scale depiction of a landscape. And this is at the very highest point of Machu Picchu. So this is the the reduced scale landscape that we're looking at. And in the distance, we're seeing Huayna Picchu. And then across the way, we're seeing Putucusi, which is here. And then this is where the archaeological site of Machu Picchu is situated here on the saddle. But as we look around it here, there's actually another channel carved throughout the landscape. And one can pour a libation onto this. And the libation traces the course of the Urubamba River that actually courses around the outside of Machu Picchu. And then the libation would drain into another crevice within the rock and go into the earth. So there's a way in which, ceremonially we can see these landscapes being used to sort of fructify the landscape, to replicate those kinds of ceremonies surrounding the coming and going of the dry season, the return of the wet season. We can see these being very important, sacred and symbolic uses of maquettes and sort of reduced scale. The last sort of group of these, though, that I want to bring up, because what it actually does is it sort of brings in the architectural space in a much clearer way, are these reduced scale mountains. So this is a large carved rock that, as we can see, creates this scalar relationship with the mountain behind it. This is also at Machu Picchu. And, Incas would look to the tallest mountain peak in the landscape as, as long as you were sort of within the viewshed of that mountain, you were in the jurisdiction of that mountain and the apus that would sort of be of that region. And so here, this is the tallest mountain in the vicinity of Machu Picchu is called Yanantin, which actually does mean sort of a pear in Quechua. But what it does is, if that mountain was the most tallest and important mountain in the landscape of Machu Picchu, it creates this sort of scalar connection between the built environment, the sort of architectural space that had been created as a royal estate, and the distant mountain that otherwise would actually be quite far from Machu Picchu. So in a way, it creates this it brings the sacred landscape into the built environment, and in some ways almost lays claim to the architectural space lays claim to the distant mountain through the reduced scale version of the mountain. And then sort of raising some of the questions that John was bringing up, sort of this like axis mundi type idea, it centers the architectural space in the built environment within the landscape rather than the mountain itself. But when it actually comes to a reduced scaled maquette, an actual singular standalone version of architecture, we have some really famous examples, one of which was in the Museo Inca in Cusco. And there's another very similar one of these here in Chicago at the Field Museum. But what's interesting for us is that this is actually one of the first objects that Spaniards see. This kind of object is probably one of the first kind of objects that Spaniards see when they meet the Incas. And in this, one of the early accounts of the conquests, and as well in an inventory of objects that get melted down, it's actually a document in French, we see mentions of architectural models of some kind. And so Atahualpa actually sends to Pizarro a set of 2 fountains. He calls them fountains. And in the way that John was sort of showing us Gothic and Renaissance micro-architecture, objects that looked like they took architectural forms at a smaller version, you can imagine some sort of basin that had an architectural shape for using to wash your hands before dinner in Europe. And it seems as if that's the kind of objects that the Spaniards think these things are. But that's what Atahualpa actually offers Pizarro. And the Spaniards don't know how to interpret this object. What is the purpose of this thing? And so in one of the accounts of these objects, that actually the Spanish interpret it as signaling to them that it's a fortress, and signaling to them that there are other fortresses up ahead within the landscape, and that the Spanish better watch out, because this is a fortified region. It's very unclear, though, if that's actually what Atahualpa meant to say by giving this object. But in sort of thinking of it, it's again, we're seeing this sort of intention of communicating something through the object. And it looks like this is some sort of gatehouse, possibly. There's evidence of similar gatehouses with similar structures at larger Inca sites. In my next book, though, what I'm looking at is a royal Inca tunic. And it raises a very different kind of question of models. One of the questions that we've always sort of asked about this is the Dumbarton Oaks tunic. It's the only surviving royal Inca tunic that exists. One of the questions that we've always asked about it is, why does it look like the way it looks? What was it that organized its patterns? What were the weavers making when they made it? And one of the reasons this has been so challenging, obviously, in these designs are called takapus, is that there's been a long thread of research that's attempted to look at these designs as a long-lost glyphic language of the Incas. And we see that there's this sort of random array of patterns across the surface of the tunic. And in colonial illustrations of these kinds of tunics, what's evident to us is that these patterns are often arranged in diagonal lines. And what we don't see here are the diagonal lines. So the question is, how did the tunic come to have the composition that it has? We've always looked at this as a garment. We've looked at this as something that the emperor would wear. So we've always tried to analyze its composition as it would have been worn on the body, which is also very indicative of the fact that we look at it as an art object now. And when we exhibit it in the museum, we look at it vertical like this. But if we really want to understand how this object was made, we have to think of it how the weaver made it, And so it wasn't actually woven in a vertical way. The tunic was actually unfolded and woven this way, horizontally. And if we look at it that way, we can actually trace how the weavers were putting the patterns into it. So if we analyze the takapus, we can see that in the first row here, we have a batch of takapus that get entered into the cloth. And in this component, we have, there's about 26 takapus that get into the tunic in total. We have about 13 that come into the first row. And then we have 13 that come into the second row. And there's the most statistical difference between those first two rows. After those first two rows, there are no new takapus that get put into the tunic. All of the knowledge to keep weaving the tunic had already been entered into the first two rows. The first two rows are the most distinct. By the time you get up to the third row, the fourth row, et cetera, they now start recombining the knowledge that was already put in the first two rows. What I think that they were doing is they were copying another tunic that had already been finished. That tunic that already existed served as the model for how to create the tunic that they then were working from. So I think we had the weavers looking at the tunic, and in the first row, they said, okay, let's do this design, this design, this design, this design. We'll enter it in. In the second row, they said, okay, we did the first one. Let's do these designs now. And they wove those in. After they'd woven the first two rows, then they could send away the model. They no longer needed it. They had the blueprint for making all of the patterns already entered into the thing that was on the loom. And after that, they could give away the model and just continue working off of the information and the knowledge that they'd already inserted into the first two rows in order to complete the object, which would have maybe taken a year longer. It's a very, very fine garment to have made. So in this sense, we're actually seeing the object itself, the same kind of object, creating this chain of self-replication, because we could very much understand that after this garment came off the loom, it too would serve as a model for the next one that was going to be made, and then the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one. So what I'm interested in is sort of the intersection now of these two ideas, using a scale model as a symbolic or ritual object that also communicated something, but then also using an object itself as the sort of instructions to remake it. And so I just want to leave us with a passage from the Chronicle of Juan de Batanzos And what it actually talks about is Pachacuti, one of the Inca emperors, rebuilding the city of Cusco. And what we're told is that Pachacuti created some kind of, he outlines the city of Cusco, presumably in the earth or on some sort of surface. And then he creates clay models of the buildings that he wants his architects to create for the redone version of the city. So after this was done, Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui outlined the city and had clay models made just as he planned to have it built. And then once the whole city is rebuilt, it says when the city was finished and made to perfection, Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui ordered all the lords of Cusco and the rest of its inhabitants to meet at a certain open field. After they assembled, he ordered that there be brought there the sketch of the city and the clay paintings that he had ordered made. With this in front of him, he assigned the houses and lots already built, as you have heard, to the lords of Cusco and to the rest of the residents. So somehow, whatever model it is that he created, both could serve as instructions for the builders and the architects to actually create in real life the city. But then it also served as the sort of device through which he then told who to go live where and what buildings to take as their new residences. So what I'm interested in us thinking, in this space around maquettes and around with so much architectural knowledge of all of you as on this seminar, is what might we have expected that object to look like? Archaeologically, we have not found that kind of Inca model. But what is that sort of threshold of detail that would have had to have been embedded in this clay object to actually be useful for a builder to recreate something from? If we look back at this image of the Cywitte Stone, we wouldn't necessarily imagine that someone could build a structure based off of this reduced scale version of a building. And similarly, in this sort of like such finely carved porphyry model of a gatehouse, would that have been enough to actually have created an actual building? And so as we looked at sort of John so wonderfully showed us so many Renaissance architectural models where there was an actual scale, that was consistent throughout the object. The relationship of the window, the width of the window to the width of the facade, this was something that was consistent and could actually, potentially have been used to recreate a building. What would we expect this object to potentially have had to have in order to serve that utilitarian function that the Batanzos is telling us Pachacuti used it for? But then finally, I would just turn that back for us one more time and say, like, what also symbolic or spiritual sort of capacity could that object have had? Because what's really interesting when we look at the architectural models that Jean has shown us is that while that was a device for understanding a design, that was a building that might never have been built and might never have been completed within the lifespan of the builder or the architect or the person paying for it. So in a way, that model actually came to be the completed idea to the people looking at it for the first time who may never have actually seen it. So in a lot of the discussions of those objects, it's addressed as if it's actually the building itself. So I'm just interested for us, as we keep moving ahead with other presentations, maybe Luis Jaime will show us some of his extraordinary moche maquetas that he's excavated. What we might have expected these objects to look like, and what we'd be looking for in the archaeological record if we hope to ever find these. So thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. No, okay. I am just happy but impressed by both of the presentations. I would like to invite all the group to make some comments or questions on both the John Stillman's or Andrew's presentations. I would like to ask you or comment, Andrew, on this idea of landscape, but not only the representation of landscape, but a kind of circularity of a system of landscape or nature. I don't know which is the word. And if you have any, and what you have said at the end of this reduce object that may have served as, for instance, to create a city and to organize the distribution of people in the city, on the notion of something that in a previous meeting, Maya and Luis Jaime were discussing about the temporality of the model, which is made to remain and which is made to disappear, but intentionally made to disappear. I don't know if you can, or both, Jean and Andrew, reflect on this idea of the model to stay permanently and the model to disappear.
It's a really important question. So, for instance, Batanzos tells us that rebuilding of Cusco took 20 years. So what's interesting is that those models seemingly were built at the beginning of the 20 years in order to instruct the builders how to rebuild it. And then at the end of the 20 years, it was used again in order to divvy up the buildings to the various residents of the city. So it had this sort of necessary lifespan that the model had to survive as long as it took to build the thing that was being built from the model. That was the purpose of the model, you know. But you're right that a model like this can have a certain ephemerality. You know, it's really remarkable that all of those models that you showed us, Jean, have survived, you know, and in such amazing condition. Because it raises the question of like, when has the model outlived its utility? You know, what was it made for? And when did it accomplish what it was meant to accomplish? And so in some ways, the fact that, you know, these extraordinary Renaissance models have survived so long might suggest that they had a different utility or additional utilities, additional reasons for being preserved beyond just the original construction or conveying of the idea. At a certain point, they gained some other resonance or some other valence that made them important, you know. And what I you know, I sort of bring up these models that Batanzos describes sort of as a hypothetical, because we don't actually have any reason to think that they survive archaeologically. You know, they may well have been destroyed. And in talking about them being made out of clay, you know, we don't actually know that they were baked clay, that they were fired. You know, this might have just been air-dried clay, and it really was potentially something ephemeral. And that's obviously so different from the Cywitte stone, which is carved from stone, the model that I showed you, which is carved from, you know, this very deep, hard red stone. And those were meant to survive. Those, by the way in which they were created, were clearly meant to sort of exist for an eternity. So it's that idea of like when the temporality of a model is critical, I think, for thinking about why it was made and what it was set out to accomplish.
Oui, dans les différentes situations dont je me suis approché, j'avais investigué en prévision du séminaire encore d'autres situations culturelles, entre autres du côté du bouddhisme ou de l'hindouisme. Si j'ajoute ces cas-là à ceux dont je vous ai parlé, il me semble que les maquettes ne sont jamais, sauf sans doute dans l'Occident moderne, post-Renaissance, destinées à être des phénomènes transitoires, des objets qui sont là provisoirement en attente d'un accomplissement plus important. Ils ont une valeur sacrée au sens très large du terme, une valeur absolue. Et je pense que c'est, et encore, mais parce qu'il y a aussi un souci de conservatisme qui est propre à notre culture occidentale actuelle. Mais les maquettes du dôme de Florence ou de Saint-Pierre de Rome n'étaient pas destinées a priori à demeurer, mais étaient des outils pour à la fois évaluer, convaincre, prendre la décision, et puis après, on les rangeait dans les archives, ne plus nécessairement être exhibés. Et c'est de manière assez récente, au cours du XXe siècle, qu'on a ressorti ces maquettes, qu'on les a exposées dans les musées ou dans les fabriques d'églises ou des choses comme celle-là. Mais donc, hormis cette situation très particulière, qui est celle dont nous dépendons, nous, je pense que les maquettes, donc les miniatures, pour utiliser un autre terme, n'étaient pas destinées à s'effacer, mais au contraire, à demeurer, à exister au même titre que des objets d'une autre taille, le cas échéant, fabriqués à partir de la référence à ces objets de petite taille.
Sí. Patricia Aparicio peut faire un commentaire.
Oui, oh, yes, sure. I have a question to Andrew. Thank you for your presentation. It was wonderful. And I'm thinking, I was thinking in the models and in Cywitte and the Titicaca. Titicaca, you say that this is in an outcrop and it's near Cusco, but Cywitte is it's in an outcrop too. So it's curved in the last part. It's not using just the outgrowth in the natural form, but it's inserted in another architectural place. So what I was thinking, if you have seen a difference between these models that are insert in an architectural site, for example, in Cywitte or maybe in Machu Picchu, because there is another one that is related with Chinchero, not in the middle of the site, but near them. If you have seen some difference in the drawings, or you have seen some difference in the way they curve the landscape, or if you have noticed something different between them.
Yeah, I mean, what's so interesting about all of those reduced scaled landscapes is that stylistically they're so different. Like stylistically, you know, size-wise, like the dimensions are totally different. The stones that they're carved from are totally different. The level of detail that they have is totally different. You know, I think it's really important, for instance, as you're pointing out, that at Titicaca, it's carved into the bedrock. It's actually of the earth. At Machu Picchu as well, it's of the earth. It's the highest point of the bedrock at the site. So it represents Machu Picchu, but it never stops being Machu Picchu. It was carved from Machu Picchu. So there's this way in which, like, the materials from which it's made are very important, because it creates this sort of physical material connection between the referent and the reduced scale object. But I think the presence of architecture around the reduced scaled objects can be really critical, because it in some ways shows us part of what the reduced scale object is being set out to achieve, you know, because there's this sort of way in which it creates a center. It creates Machu Picchu as the center of a sacred landscape by virtue of what the model sets out to show, you know. And I don't know, for instance, like, I'd be curious to know whether you think the same thing is being done at Sandondo. At Titicaca, one could sit on top of that outcrop and sort of survey the entire Cusco Valley. But the set of terraces that were actually carved, they don't really have a sort of visual or structural relationship to identifiable terraces nearby. They seem just like a generic representation of terraces. And so there, it seems like one might use that reduced scale landscape to enact some kind of ritual there. But it doesn't have the same quality of like placemaking and sort of creating the sort of centering of the built environment and the implications for everything around it that we might see or we might consider at the Machu Picchu examples or at Cywitte. And I think that's kind of a critical difference between these two, potentially two categories of reduced scaled landscapes.
Yeah, I think it's a tough thing that we have to think about because there are really high differences between them, between the landscape and between the landscape that we could see now. Because I know that in Titicaca we are in the middle of Cusco, and the middle of Cusco have been changed really, really hard. And this is a huge difference between Sondondo, because Sondondo is a valley that is just really far away from all these main roads and all these main focus of tourism. So it's not really changed. The landscape is not really changed. So maybe this thing that we could talk about or discuss or think about it. Yeah, thank you.
Luis Jaime, please.
¿Aló?
Aló.
Sí, perdón. Okay, great talks. I mean, wonderful talks, thought-provoking and opening new avenues.
We've lost you, Luis Jaime. Is you?
¿Aló?
Hello, ahora, yes.
Okay. If you can allow me to share my screen. ¿Aló? ¿Aló?
Sí, Luis Jaime.
Sí, ¿pueden ver la pantalla?
Yes.
Miren, el tema para mí es fascinante, este tema, pero hay que recordar que este fenómeno no solamente está circunscrito a Cywitte, ¿no? En realidad, piedras talladas como la que pueden ver en esta pantalla hay por todas partes. Y esta de aquí, que es maravillosa, está nada más y nada menos que en Sacsayhuamán, a las afueras del Cusco, ¿no? No hay que olvidar también esta de aquí, que es la de Kenko, ¿no es cierto? Donde tenemos igual una cantidad gigantesca de tallas, ¿no? Y como estas las vamos a ver en muchísimos lugares, ¿no? Esta de aquí, por ejemplo, es Yurak Rumi en Rosapata. Es una cuestión un poco diferente, ¿no? Pero la categoría de talla de piedras, ¿no? es una categoría que es fascinante. Fascinante, porque claramente hay significado detrás de este tipo de cosas. El problema es dar el paso entre reconocer el fenómeno y poder entender el fenómeno, que son dos cosas diferentes, ¿no? Para mí, como arqueólogo, lo primero es tener un buen registro, es decir, poder acceder a este tipo de información, porque muy probablemente este tipo de imágenes ninguno de los presentes haya visto nunca, ¿no es cierto? Y ahí entramos en el tema, ¿no es cierto?, de la digitalización y de los modelos numéricos, como decía, ¿no? Es decir, la posibilidad de tener acceso a este tipo de imágenes, que son el inicio de cualquier investigación, porque si no podemos acceder a la data, ¿no?, estamos perdidos. Entonces, tenemos este tipo de cosas, y tenemos incluso cosas que son hasta más fascinantes, porque, por ejemplo, miren, esto que está aquí es uno de los farallones del sitio de Ollantaytambo, donde pueden darse cuenta cómo todo el farallón, toda la piedra está tallada, completamente toda, ¿no? Para los que hayan visitado el sitio alguna vez, es fascinante, ¿no? Fíjense. Entonces, el fenómeno que estamos tratando de estudiar desde varias perspectivas tiene una cuestión mayor. Para mí, el tema por ejemplo, de estas piedras que tallan landscapes y este tipo de piedras que están en el centro de lugares de culto, las que encontramos en Machu Picchu, tienen que tener un denominador común, tienen que haber cumplido una función común, ¿no? Pareciera que es una suerte de juego, ¿no? De aprovechar cualquier superficie rocosa para crear este tipo de impresiones, porque hay piedras como estas en Chinchero, hay piedras como estas en muchísimos sitios, ¿no? Nosotros en los años pasados hemos mapeado tridimensionalmente 120 sitios incas y las hemos encontrado por todas partes, y en un punto que es sorprendente y que nunca nos habíamos percatado de la complejidad del asunto. Claro, la tecnología que se usa te permite hacer ese tipo de cosas, ¿no? Porque las imágenes, que pueden ser incluso mejores, ¿no? Las imágenes tienen que tener la capacidad de darte este tipo de visualización. Te permite hacer ese tipo de cosas, ¿no? Porque las imágenes, que pueden ser incluso mejores. Las imágenes tienen que tener la capacidad de darte este tipo de visualización. Te permite hacer ese tipo de cosas, ¿no?
Luis Jaime?
Sí.
Oui.
Pésima.
And so, Luis Jaime, entonces para ti, ¿cómo sirve representación? Entonces, en como Cywitte tenemos representaciones de pequeños animales, de personas, de arquitectura. ¿Qué piensas? ¿Por qué no hay estos elementos en...
Mira, yo no estoy convencido en la tesis un poco simplista de que las piedras representan el paisaje y que solamente son como una suerte de un poco lo de la cita que tenía hace tanto, ¿no? Que yo hago una maqueta para luego distribuir propiedades, ¿no? Yo creo que eso no, porque si uno es riguroso realmente, riguroso, ni siquiera las piedras de Machu Picchu tienen una resemblanza real a los cerros que la rodean, ¿no? Y Cywitte no representa definitivamente el paisaje que está enfrente, o sea, para ser absolutamente riguroso, ¿no? Entonces, yo creo que su propósito no era, además, digamos, y la pregunta es, ¿tenían la capacidad como para poder haber representado esos paisajes? Sí, por supuesto que sí. Es decir, que si no lo hicieron, no fue porque no pudieron, sino porque no quisieron hacerlo, ¿no es cierto? Entonces, estas piedras y estas tallas no tienen un propósito, digamos, factual en el sentido de representar la realidad. Yo creo que se representan algo diferente. Y creo que las piedras que encontramos en el corazón de Cusco, las piedras que encontramos en Chinchero, en Ollantaytambo, en Kenco, ¿no es cierto?, en estos sitios que están en el corazón del imperio, son una muy buena indicación porque piedras como las de Cywitte seguramente se hicieron después de que el paradigma se había creado en estos lugares centrales para el culto, para las panacas reales incas, etc. Entonces yo creo que la explicación no es simplemente hacer una grafía, porque para eso hubieran hecho, efectivamente, como dice la imagen, ¿no es cierto?, modelos de arcilla, fáciles de hacer. Tallar el granito no es nada fácil, ¿no? Y cuando uno ve las tallas que se encuentran en este sitio, por ejemplo, en Ollantaytambo, se da uno cuenta de que realmente, por ejemplo, para tallar el granito que ustedes ven aquí, tan plano, es un esfuerzo particular. Parece que el propósito es hacerlo, no es conseguir necesariamente una forma, es como una especie de prueba, ¿no?, de la calidad que tiene el tallador, qué sé yo, ¿no? Y si vamos a las otras, es lo mismo, o sea, son intricadísimas. Esta de Rosapata, por ejemplo, que está además en el último confín del imperio, porque está cerca de Vilcabamba, ¿no? Este sitio de Rosapata es la Vilcabamba de Manco Inca, y este sitio fue destruido cuando se combatió contra Manco Inca, ¿no? Pero si te fijas, es sorprendente, o sea, toda la talla, o sea, es el trabajo mismo, parece que hubiera sido algo en sí mismo importante, ¿no?
But now,
no, I would like to ask you. Il y a une idée que je crois que c'est intéressant pour relier avec la présentation des gens, et c'était cette idée de la possibilité d'un modèle célibataire. Donc la question de ce que tu disais aussi, Andrew, on the question of what is that allows the passage from the object represented to the representation from the object represented. No? And I would like to ask Jean aussi s'il pouvait développer un peu plus, si c'est pensable, un modèle pas référentiel, un modèle vraiment célibataire, ça existe vraiment, et à partir de cela, quelle serait la nécessité du transférable, de la transmission, et est-ce que la dimension de transférence fractale, c'est nécessairement géométrique et dimensionnel, ou il y en a d'autres critères de fractalité pour la transférence?
En tout cas, à propos de Cywitte et puis des choses que Luis Crème vient de nous montrer maintenant et que je ne connaissais pas du tout, parce que à part Sandondo et Cywitte, je connaissais, enfin oui, plus évidemment Machu Picchu, mais je ne savais pas qu'il y avait un nombre d'occurrences aussi important et différencié. Ce qu'on a vu là, les flancs taillés, gigantesque, on n'est même pas là dans une question de représentation. Enfin, si on associe la représentation de la maquette à une question d'échelle réduite. Mais ce qui m'intrigue dans ces travaux Inca, c'est l'importance de tailler des plans, planéité, 2D, dans quelque chose qui est complètement étranger, à savoir le rocher, la montagne, et que ce soit de manière horizontale ou verticale. L'image que j'ai montrée de cette boule de granit à Cywitte, elle est taillée, il y a un plateau horizontal qui est fait. On a conservé à la boule une courbe qui est peut-être en analogie avec la courbe des montagnes, des collines, et aussi un plat vertical qui est soigneusement taillé. Voilà. Donc, ce n'est pas à l'imitation de quelque chose, mais il semble que je sais pas, dans le monde Inca, dans la culture Inca, cette référence à ce qui pour nous apparaît comme étant une abstraction, le plan horizontal, le plan vertical, de la géométrie que nous avons thématisé autrement, mais ce soit là. Et en analogie, il n'y a rien du tout. Mais en analogie, à quoi? Peut-être un modèle mental, je ne sais pas. Et peut-être que je crois aussi qu'il peut y avoir des objets qui sont inauguraux, qui inventent quelque chose, et puis après, ça se répète, ça se déplace, ça se déforme, ça se multiplie. Je n'en sais rien. Je ne crois pas trop non plus à ça, parce que je pense que quand des choses apparaissent, c'est d'entrée de jeu dans un système de relations, de répétition, etc. Donc, je ne crois pas enfin, je me trompe peut-être, je ne crois pas à un dispositif qui inaugurerait tout seul. Les choses sont toujours bien plus compliquées, bien plus en système que ça. Mais c'est assez fascinant parce que cette histoire de la planéité, je ne connais pas suffisamment les cultures andines, mais il me semble qu'elle soit spécifique au monde Inca. Il n'était pas présent de cette façon-là, en tout cas, je pense, chez les Wari ou chez les Moche. Voilà, je trouve ça assez étonnant. Et d'autant que les Incas, c'est un gros siècle, quoi, donc c'est une aventure assez courte, culturellement parlant. Et oui, moi je trouve ça... mais c'est un peu un titre de provocation, j'ai parlé de solitaire et célibataire, parce que fondamentalement, je n'y crois pas, mais ce qu'il y a, c'est qu'on ne voit pas à l'image de quoi ça pourrait être, ou le modèle de quoi ça a été par ailleurs. C'est simplement ça que je voulais dire.
C'est une question, celle qui a montré Luis Jaime, que tu as remarqué, cette histoire de la construction du plan horizontal ou du plan vertical. Et surtout parce que c'est vrai que la création d'une certaine horizontale, c'est assez important dans l'architecture et la modélisation du paysage Inca. Mais mais il y a aussi dans l'architecture plus fine, non? Les murs qui sont jamais verticaux, non? Qui sont légèrement diagonales. Non? Il y a eu aussi une intentionnalité techniquement hyper difficile, non? Parce que ce n'est pas la facilité qui explique cette je ne vais pas dire déviation, mais cette question, mais qui apparaissent différemment dans la représentation qui nous a montré, par exemple, dans le Cywitte.